What's up? I'm AJ and welcome back to Gen Z Garage. I'm here today with the 2009 Ford Explorer Sport, which we are going to be replacing the front driver's side wheel hub. It's raining, there's like a weird noise coming from somewhere. We're still gonna work on the car.
This is actually my dad's car, which we affectionately call Diego because our previous Ford Explorer was called Dora. My dad recently said that the car just didn't feel right when he drove it, and that the front left wheel felt a little rough. He also hinted that if I wanted parts to magically appear for my failre, that this would go a long way to keep that going. We started off by jacking up the front of the car. I placed the jack under the center of the frame's cross member. We're going to lift the entire front of the car off the ground so that we can run a test on both front wheels, which you will see in a few seconds. We start with the passenger side wheel for no particular reason other than that this is the good wheel. I place painter's tape on the fender and then in line with the wheel itself. When the wheel is spun by hand, we can more easily count the number of rotations. So what's the point of this, you might ask? Believe it or not, this is a really good way to tell if your wheel bearings are starting to fail. The good wheel should spin more freely than the wheel with the bad bearing. It can also be an indication of a sticking brake. However, a sticking brake caliper would have other symptoms and be more obvious when driving. This test is helpful because sometimes wheel bearings start to go out, but they do not always give the proverbial grinding noise. Let's spin the wheel and see. Not bad, 5.5 rotations. This wheel will be a good baseline. Let's do the other side now. Same as with the other wheel, we put tape on the fender, then in line with the wheel. Let's give this wheel a spin and see how we do.
Ashley, go ahead. I'll tell you what, some rounds are just tougher than others, aren't they?
Barely 2 rotations. We obviously know this wheel hub is bad. I lower the jack so I can reposition it, but first I'm going to engage the emergency brake to ensure that the car isn't going to move while I work on it. Believe it or not, the easiest way to break the lug nuts loose is to do it while the car is still on the ground. The weight of the car will bear down on the wheel and prevent it from spinning, making it much easier to loosen them first. I hate seeing people get the car up on the jack first, then try to unscrew the wheel while it's spinning. With the wheel lugs loose, I now position the jack under the front of the lower control arm and get enough clearance so that the wheel is up in the air. I can then easily remove the lug nuts using my stubby socket wrench. I'll also place a jack stand under the rear of the lower control arm after I've removed the wheel. With the lugs off, I carefully remove the 40-pound wheel and drag it off to the side as my dad looks on casually while drinking his Diet Coke. With the wheel off, I then slide it under the side of the car. It's a little trick I learned that acts as a last bit of protection in case the car falls off the jack and the jack stand. Before I can remove the wheel hub, I'll need to remove the braking components. I start with the brake caliper. The caliper is held in place by 2 small bolts, so remove them carefully so you don't lose them. My electric impact wrench makes short work of the bolts, and they come off pretty easily. You may need to hold onto the caliper as it may fall out if there isn't a lot of tension on the pads. Next, you'll need to remove the caliper and hang it out of the way. Make sure the caliper isn't left hanging by the brake hose. Many people use a coat hanger, but I use a gardener's S-hook, which you can buy for about $5 at any garden center. Next, you'll need to remove the caliper bracket. This bracket is bolted directly to the steering knuckle and is attached by 2 large machine bolts. Be sure to take note of the red color on the bolt. These use red Loctite. The pads may get loose and fall off. Yup. Just remember what side they went on. I remove the last bolt and take the whole assembly and set it off to the side. Next, we remove the rotor by lifting it up and out. If your rotor is original, it may have a rotor washer attached to one of the lugs, which will need to be removed first. With the rotor off, you will now have access to the wheel hub, but before you can remove it, we'll need to disconnect the ABS wheel sensor. This sensor is integrated into the wheel hub. On some replacement models, you can remove this, but a new wheel hub will already come with a replacement. The wire is held in place through a series of clips, snaps, and even a bracket which is held down by a machine screw. I remove the machine screw and bracket first. Once the screw is out, I work my way up the harness, removing all of the various clips and snaps that hold the wire in place. Depending on year, there are as many as 5 and as few as 3 points that the wire is secured to. You'll also want to disconnect the connector at the top. You can remove it from within the wheel well, as I have, but it's usually easier to access it from within the engine compartment. When the wire is disconnected at the top and removed from all its snap points, I snake it out from the suspension and hang it off to the side and begin removing the wheel hub. The wheel hub is attached with 3 bolts that mount it to the steering knuckle. These bolts used a thread locker, so remember to reapply when you install the new one. If your Explorer is a 4x4, there would also be an additional nut in the center of the hub holding the hub to the drive shaft. You'll need to remove this first before the hub will come out. While all 3 of me are slaving away on my dad's car, removing each bolt simultaneously, yet interdimensionally, this would be a good time to tell you about my Fiero project. I recently got a 1985 Pontiac Fiero that I've been restoring as my first car. If you're interested, the link to the first video is at the top. What to look for when buying a used Fiero. My goal is to have this car finished by the time I get my driver's license. I hope you will join me on this adventure. The hub simply drops out after removing the 3 bolts. If your car is rusty, or again, a 4x4, you will likely have a bit more difficulty getting it off, and may need to use a hammer. There is an aftermarket bracket tool that you can purchase to make the removal easier. With the wheel hub off, we can begin the reinstallation process. There is no preparation needed before installing the new one. Just make sure you correctly orient the hub in the same direction the old one was when you removed it. The wire coming off the hub should point towards the rear of the car. I will temporarily reinstall and hand tighten one of the bolts in order to make reinstallation easier. All 3 bolts will require Loctite, so I'll be removing this bolt again at the end. For the 3 hub bolts, they use red Loctite, which is the one that's supposed to be permanent. They aren't technically permanent as I was able to remove the bolts in the first place. The red thread locker is placed around the threads of the bolt, and when torqued down, will expand and fill micro cavities in the metal. This creates a solid bond with the bolt hole, and prevents the bolts from backing out over use and through the various heat cycles. I put a few drops on the threads in the same place where it was originally. The thread locker dries fairly quickly, so I have only a minute or so to install the bolt quickly. I take the bolt over to the hub and hand tighten it first. Then I wrench it down as hard as I can. The specific torque requirements differ from year to year, but generally you want anywhere from 35 to 40 foot-pounds. Then we do the same for the next bolt. And finally, we remove and reinstall the 3rd bolt that we'd originally hand tightened to hold the hub in place. Next, we reattach the ABS wire and fish it up through the suspension, remembering to reattach it all in the original places, including the bracket that holds to the knuckle. Then, we reattach the sensor connector at the top in the engine bay. Next, we put the brake rotor back onto the wheel hub. This needs to be done before you bolt the brake caliper bracket back on. With the rotor on, we reinstall the brake caliper bracket. This is held in place by 2 bolts, which must be torqued down to the correct torque specifications for your year. These bolts also use the red permanent thread locker. With the bracket installed, we can reinstall the brake pads. Before we reinstall the brake caliper, we'll hand tighten one of the lug nuts onto the rotor. This helps keep the rotor flush to the hub and makes it easier to reinstall the caliper. Finally, with everything in place, we reinstall the brake caliper. The 2 bolts that hold the brake caliper onto the bracket also use thread locker, but instead use the blue semi-permanent liquid and not the red liquid. With everything installed, we remove the lug we put on earlier and spray the rotor surface area with brake cleaner to remove any grease on the braking surface. We can now put the wheel back on. My dad helps me with this because the tire and the wheel weigh almost as much as I do. I reinstall the lug nuts in a star pattern, then remove the jack stand and lower the car into the ground, and finally tighten the lug nuts with the weight of the car back in the wheel.
In this video, we replaced the wheel hub of this 2009 Ford Explorer. If you found this informative, please make sure to like and subscribe so you can see my progress in restoring my Fiero over there in other videos. Thank you for watching and have a great day. AJ.exe has encountered an error.